Thanks for tuning in to Witch Wednesdays with Steph and Tara, where we share our knowledge as we chat about a new witchcraft topic every Wednesday morning. Welcome back to Witch Wednesdays. This is Steph.
And this is Tara.
And you're listening to episode 63 about the Wiccan Deities.
Woohoo!
So we got a lot of questions when we asked what people just wanted to hear about this year in general. And something that came up a lot was about deity work in general. And okay, first of all, I want to say that I say it deities and Tara says it deities, and both ways are correct. Just so you know.
Start off the bat.
Deities is because the Latin word for God is dei, and I've already talked about how I took Latin dei is God in Latin, so that's how I say it. Deities is very common in America, so
yeah,
either way,
how I learned it.
Yeah, either way is totally fine. So so if you hear us pronounce it two different ways and you're very confused, whichever one feels more comfortable to you, both totally fine. So we decided to start with Wiccan deities, and then we are going to have another episode coming up about different pagan paths, because depending on which sort of path you go down, that can influence which deities you work with, and then an additional episode after that about working with deities outside of this traditional Wiccan construct. So we have a lot of episodes scheduled to get you more comfortable with working with deities and just the ins and outs of everything. And the Wiccan deities seemed like the best place to start, because the next episode that we have for you is on Ostara. And then when we talk about the aspects of the goddess as they relate to Ostara, it will make a little more sense.
Hopefully.
Having this one first.
Hopefully.
So we talked a little bit before about the history of Wicca. That was way in the beginning of last season.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to go back and learn a little bit more about Wicca and how that's different from witchcraft. But it is a relatively new religion that was introduced by Gerald Gardner in the 1950s. And he believed in the principle of duality. So he believed that there was this balance between the genders of male and female, and regarded them as divine lovers and polar opposites. So they balance each other out, and one could not exist without the other. So that is a main tenet of the Wiccan belief. Now, there are different sects of Wicca. There's like a Dianic Wiccan religion about the goddess Diana, and they do focus more on the female aspect of the goddess. So it's not exactly equal, but traditional Wicca, if you are just beginning into it, it is a dual religion, and you have to have both the god and goddess.
And that's common in a lot of the sects. They might focus on certain aspects of the god or goddess more, or the god or the goddess more. It's just hard as humans to split our attention equally. So a lot of sects are like that. They might have more emphasis, and different holidays emphasize the god or goddess more. So
yeah, Yule is way more about the god.
Yep.
And Ostara, goddess.
Yes, very much so.
Just how it works.
And it's, overall it balances, but there's definitely focus areas for holidays, for sex, for everything in life. So
Wicca is obviously not the only one that believes in this dual.
No, it's very common.
Yes, there's Odin and Frigg in Norse mythology. There's Isis and Osiris in Egyptian mythology. There's Zeus and Hera in Greek mythology. So there are a lot of this like dual male and female. So
yin and yang.
Yes. So there's lots of different ways that you can incorporate that. And we have lots of pagan paths to talk about, Greek and Egyptian and all of those things. So just know that it is very common to have these two deities, male and female. I think
balance.
When we are raised in like a Christian construct, it's very hard to turn off that way of thinking, that there's just this one divine being that's generally male and is the end all be all, and there's no like female counterpart to that. We really have to
I always thought as a non-Catholic that Catholics try and balance that, because Mary is got her own altars and idols and everything, but that's an outside perspective, not a Catholic perspective.
Well, yeah, they definitely do emphasize Mary quite a bit, but when it's, it's one all-powerful God, that's, yeah. So if you're going to go down a Wiccan religion or work with deities in another path, it's definitely, you have to unlearn that. And another tenet of Wicca that Tara can speak a little more about is that all Wiccan gods and goddesses are actually one being.
Supreme.
Yes. So in Christianity, we talk about Jesus and God and the Holy Spirit kind of all being like one thing, but otherwise it's hard for us to see that as being all one powerful God. But in the Wiccan religion, there can be lots of different names and different aspects, and we're going to get into that, but they all come down to being one God, male or female.
Yep. So, and the way I learned it was, if you think of the universe as a whole, the entire universe, it's simply too much for humans to grasp. Like, if I say the universe, what's in my mind is slightly different than your mind. And we can both be correct because there's just so much out there and humans are finite and we just can't grasp that infinite. So the divine is like the universe. It's just so much that we almost distill it down into a god and goddess so that we can grasp the concepts. And we're not being offensive. We're just simply putting our own interpretation on. We're trying to incorporate it all, but it's just too big. Like if you hold water in your cupped hands, there's more than if you separate it, but it's sometimes easier if you separate like grains of sand into two hands. Now, if you put it together, there's even more than you can grasp in the individual hands. But like humans just aren't meant to function with all of this knowledge. It's very difficult for us. So that's how it's explained to me. That's why we worship both the god and goddess, because we're trying to get as many aspects as possible of the ultimate divine. And it's simply too much for us to grasp and easily work with. So the god and goddess are parts of that whole. And hopefully we're getting as much of the whole as possible into these two separate things, which is why balance is so important in the Wiccan belief.
And there's lots of, like we talked about the Dianic sect, there's different sects, and a lot of modern Wiccan, I mean, I guess it was in the 1950s, all Wiccans are modern, but especially today, Wiccans like to work with a variety of gods and goddesses on different pagan paths. So when they work with any of the goddesses of the Greek or Norse mythology, you can still do that if you are a Wiccan. You can still work with Odin or Hera or Aphrodite or all of those things. It just comes down to, in the Wiccan belief, that those are all aspects of the one singular god and goddess. They all come back to the same point. So the aspects of Aphrodite as a love goddess and her associations with the sea, those are one aspects of this traditional Wiccan goddess. All parts of the same thing.
Yeah, that's one reason why pagan and Wiccanism sometimes gets interchanged so much. Pagans, in my experience, are more likely to worship these different aspects under particular names and these particular goddesses or gods. Wiccans also do that, but then they also have the main goddess and the main god that they worship during the high holidays and things. So they might pray to a particular goddess or god, but in the high holidays, they tend to focus on the main goddess and god, whereas pagans may only worship a particular aspect. Ugh, wow, look at my pronunciation. And they may not always focus on the higher, I don't want to say higher tier, but the more infinite god, triple goddess and horn god.
Which is exactly what we are about to get into. The two deities that are most often referred to as the Wiccan gods are the triple goddess and the horned god. So we will start with the goddess. The triple goddess is the main goddess within Wicca, and she's also known as the moon goddess and the primary representation of that divine feminine power.
Yep.
So she is closely associated with the earth and the moon.
She's sometimes called the Earth Mother.
And as the Earth Mother, she represents the physical energy that lets life grow, right? So it's
Yep.
women are the ones that are capable of growing and birthing a child.
The
The Earth
fertility
Mother,
of the earth and women.
exactly. So all associations with domesticated animals, fields, and crops, and all of those things. And her energy is nurturing and tender, and she can be seen in lots of other religions as well. And
sometimes not as tender. She can be kind of strict, which is why we have natural disasters sometimes. But she's teaching us lessons and nurturing us to our end destination.
And she is the one that keeps the wheel of the year turning. So
Correct.
She's the master of those cycles of the earth, the growth, birth, growth, death, rebirth, all of those things. So getting rid of the old and bringing in the new. And as the moon goddess, she, of course, rules the night and the tides.
Mm-hmm. So she's the ultimate force of change.
And also represents emotion and intuition and wisdom that comes from our, darker side. And this moon goddess aspect has probably the most forms in other religions and throughout history. So in the Greek mythology, it's Artemis and Diana. Those would be aspects of this moon goddess in Wicca.
Yep. And there are definitely Wiccans that celebrate particularly Diana and Artemis. And we've talked about them before, and we'll talk about them again.
So let's get into this idea of the triple goddess, because Tara has talked about that when we talk about
the cycles of the year.
Yeah, the different Sabbats that we go over, because that is something that comes up as she travels through her life and everything, but we haven't really touched on exactly what that triple goddess actually means.
Yes.
So she is a triple deity who is portrayed as either a single goddess who changes in a yearly cycle, or as one with three distinct aspects. And it mirrors the stages of a woman going through life. And Gerald Gardner specifically did not believe in the triple goddess. That was not one of his teachings, but lots of other Wiccan practitioners were drawn to her. And there was another coven founder around the same time as Gerald Gardner, and his name was Robert Cochrane. And he was thought to have brought the triple goddess into the modern Wiccan movement.
Yep.
So it was mostly during the 1970s that the triple goddess became so firmly rooted in Wiccan worship. And now people believe that, most Wiccans believe that as like a main tenet now, even though it wasn't specific to Gerald Gardner.
And again, this can vary by sect, whether you see the triple goddess as three distinct aspects or one goddess going through phases. But yeah, the concept is deeply rooted now.
Yes. So let's jump into what these three aspects are. So the first aspect is the Maiden.
Yes.
The Maiden is associated with the crescent to waxing phase of the moon cycle. She represents youth, sexuality, enchantment, and beginnings. She's also seen as the goddess of the dawn, sunrises, and spring. She's full of potential, just like the new moon and its growing cycle, and is seen as innocent, youthful, confident, and intelligent. She also represents exploring, discovering new things, and creativity, growth of new ideas, all of those things. Mm-hmm. So she is specifically the aspect of the goddess that you would invoke if you wanted help with anything related to a new beginning, like a new relationship, a new job, a new project, or anything in the area of new beginnings.
Yeah. And if you remember when we talked about the phases of the moon, she's so tightly tied in with the concept of that same concept. So a lot of the things that you might want to spell cast in that very beginning of the moon phase that we talked about, this is also, she's the perfect one to invoke for those kinds of spell work. And that's before she turns into the mother. So at the full moon, the mother aspect of the goddess comes to the front or is really the focus. She's the giver of life. Fertility is a huge part of this. She represents responsibility, adulthood, the fullness of life. Her time is midday, and her season is summer, when everything is growing and changing. So the fields are bursting with crops. Young animals are growing into adulthood. She is one of the most powerful aspects of the goddess, because what's more powerful than giving life? She is the goddess that you would want to invoke if you need help with fertility, motherhood, protection, achievement of inner peace, intuition, and stability, which I always find the stability part both more hopeful, because if you're raising children, stable is always the goal, but maybe not your day-to-day.
And then the final aspect is the crone, which actually used to be called the hag, but not anymore.
I still call it the hag sometimes.
And this is the goddess of the waning of the moon. So she's the representation of life after children, of aging, past lives, and death.
And wisdom.
She is definitely the least understood and least liked aspect of the goddess, because she makes us think about death. And sometimes people associate that with evil, but she is actually very wise and is just there to guide us into the next phase of our lives, because death is a normal part of the cycle of life, just like the cycle of the moon. It just becomes nothing and then starts all over again, and before becoming full.
Bring it back around.
Her seasons are autumn and winter, and she rules over sunsets and nights. So the crone is the aspect of the goddess that you would invoke if you want spiritual guidance, help with ending a relationship or job, menopause, or strong protection.
Because she has the wisdom to protect you beyond the day-to-day.
So she's definitely the least worked with, but a very interesting aspect. So definitely don't ignore it.
I think that's almost like the American in us. We don't want to think about death or beyond a certain phase of life. And so we tend to ignore what is very powerful and wise and out there to help and assist us. But that's just me thinking as an American.
So let's talk about the other half then, which is the Wiccan God.
Yes.
Again, you can choose lots of gods to worship and work with that would tie into this God. They're all different aspects of this one singular, the Wiccan God. But when people talk about the Wiccan God, they are namely talking about the horned God, also known as the green God.
I think people that come to Wiccanism from a Christian background, they don't like calling it the horned God because it invokes Satan in their minds, because the church has done such a great job of trying to make those two identical in church mythology. They really have. So I think that the horned God is something that people that are raised Wiccan or are maybe just less Christian based in their thinking are comfortable with. But if you're talking to someone who is coming to Wicca from a Christian background, a lot of times they're a lot more comfortable with the green God. They're the same God. And the is all capital, the God.
So the horned God represents obviously the male side of this dual religion, and is the representation of the sun, hunting, death, and magic. And like we said, this was the Gerald Gardner belief of equal balance. Yeah. But the horned God definitely has, and green God definitely have more associations with certain Sabbats, and you're going to see them more times of the year. Whereas the goddess seems to be omnipresent and worked with more, and people just tend to work with the god really around, like Beltane and Yule are like very popular holidays for working with this male energy. But the male energy, the Wiccan God in general, still has a dual nature. He is the hunter and also the hunted. So he's the sun during the day, which is all powerful and mighty. But then he's also the sun during the night when it's blacked out and hidden.
Yeah.
And he's also known as the green man, who is an ancient god of fertility. And that's still a common archetype all around the world.
Yes. Very much so. And the green man is generally the aspect that people focus on around Beltane, and then the horn god is a lot of time focused more on Yule.
That's because the horns are an ancient symbol of virility that been used in the lots of pagans ancient times used virility horns as depiction of their gods. You'll find that across all different pagan paths.
Yes, very much so.
So that comes out at Yule for sure. There's antlers everywhere.
Yeah, antlers
Reindeer.
everywhere because they want the green to come back. They want nature to bloom. It's time. Not a winter person.
So he is definitely a symbol of the natural world. So sometimes the best personification of that is the Greek god Pan. Pan is the half goat, half human, sometimes with horns, sometimes without. And he is one of the really well-known ancient pagan gods. He used to be worshipped a lot, probably one of the most. And the church definitely hated this.
Oh yeah.
So that's where the idea of this horned god was turned into the idea of the devil.
The devil.
Yeah, the Lord of Evil. We've talked about that, of how, the church was really clever about changing these people's ideas of their religion. So that's kind of, Pan was widely associated, like the celebrations were widely associated with orgies. Yeah. So the church definitely tried to get rid of that. And that's kind of how they turned him into this evil horned god. And he also is the aspect of the god that helps guide people into the afterlife, which is just like the crone. It's a natural part of life, and he helps guide souls into the next phase of existence. But that also fed into that negative portrayal of him as, being guiding souls to the depths of hell and things like that the church used to say. So that's part of the reason of his negative portrayal, but it's definitely not.
That can be positive too, because he's also the hunted beast that fed the tribe. So he's both the victim and the villain here.
But definitely, like the crone, not an aspect of evil.
No, definitely
not. So the duality of this horned god, along with the three aspects of the triple goddess, are often thought to make up the 5 points of the pentagram. We talked about the pentagram lots, and there's lots of different ways to interpret it. It can also be the 5 elements and all things like that. So that's one way to interpret it, is the 5 points of the pentagram, and one way to invoke all of those aspects is using that pentagram. And the god is in a cyclical relationship with the triple goddess, which we touched on in all of our Sabbath episodes. He dies when the harvests are taken in the autumn, buried in winter, and then born again from the triple goddess in the spring when everything is fresh and green, and then impregnates her and starts the whole cycle all over again. So
yeah, it's a little strange if you think about the details too much. So
try not to focus on that.
Yeah, I'm just gonna say it is a little strange. And even though he's buried, he kind of comes back at Yule, which is how she gets pregnant. And so the details, they also vary by sect, but those are the overarching themes.
Can get a little fuzzy, but
depending on the sect in your path.
Yeah. So hopefully just the overview of the two and what their different aspects are will make it a little more clear when we talk about them again in Sabbath episodes, like when we talk about the goddess next week in Ostara. It'll make a little more sense about how these interact, and then we get into Beltane and hand fasting and all of that. So hopefully this cleared up some of the questions that you might have.
This didn't add confusion, at least.
But we know it's possible, and when you're just starting out, it seems like a lot of overwhelming information.
Yes, very much.
And you definitely do not have to be a Wiccan to practice witchcraft. We've already gone over that. And you don't have to work with deities at all in that case. If you want to choose a different pagan path, we are going to have more information coming up on that. But if this does sound like it's interesting to you and you have more questions, reach out to us anytime. Witchwednesdays.com. We have all of the ways to contact us on there.
Yes.
And as we mentioned, we set up a Discord community, and we set up a post and a board for every episode. So you can get in there and ask your questions, and
discuss.
there are, discuss if anything that we forgot or you want to add, you can add that in there. And there are a lot of witches on different paths, but including Wicca, so they can answer any questions that you have about how they work with the different aspects of the god and goddess. You can get a lot more information because obviously everybody's path and practice is completely different.
Yeah, and a lot of sects have very, I don't want to say different, but more codified beliefs. So if you are following a particular sect, because I don't follow one of the main sects, I'm eclectic. So there are certain things that I believe that particular sects may, I don't want to say frown upon, but have a lot more defined ideas on. So that's very important. But when you're first starting out too, let this have time to settle in your mind. You can always say the goddess without defining an aspect. You can say goddesses without defining particular aspects or names. So wait for it to settle. Don't try and force this into your head if you are feeling the Wiccan path, but not 100% sure yet. When I started out, I always just said God and goddess. I still say goddess a lot. I don't have to say a particular aspect, and I don't name a particular Diana or Artemis or anything like that. So it's all your own path.
But definitely reach out if you have any questions, and hopefully the community can help guide you. But if you are not Wiccan and don't find a connection with this Wiccan path or religion at all, then definitely stay tuned for, I think this is episode 63, and episode 66 is going to be about finding your pagan path, and which is more my realm. Wiccan is definitely Tara's realm, and the different pagan paths is more my realm. So that will give you a lot more information about, different things that you can look into and choose. And then like a specific finding and working with deities episode will be a couple episodes after that. So we have a lot more information coming. And
we are building on this. Yes.
Hopefully didn't confuse you too much.
Hopefully. It is a confusing concept, like I said, and paganism has a lot more paths available. So if this doesn't exactly fit you, you can still be a witch without Wiccan. We've said it millions and millions of times, I feel like, at this point, but you can be both also.
That is all we have for you this week, and we will see you next week for Ostara.
Yay! Thanks for listening, guys. Bye.
Need even more witchcraft? Subscribe to our Patreon account for tons of exclusive bonus content and order supplies from our Etsy store. Reach out on Instagram at Witch Wednesdays Podcast or by email to witchwednesdays@gmail.com if you have any questions or comments. Find all these links and more at witchwednesdays.com.